Hello class, and welcome to our first lesson today on the Reformation. Behold the glimmering city in front of you, an artist's vision of the gates of heaven. How is it that you get there? Well, it is this sort of question that is going to launch one of the greatest struggles in European history. It will forever shape the way in which the world of Western Europe, and all places influenced thereby, see the world around them. So first, let's take a look at the players. You have the papacy, headed by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, considered the successor of St. Peter and head of Christianity in Europe. He also rules over the Papal States in central Italy. Then you have the Holy Roman Empire, massive Germanic kingdom in the center of Europe. This empire has a peculiar relationship with the papacy. In one breath, the emperors and the popes are rivals, yet in the other, the emperors rule by grace of the pope. Additionally, these emperors are constantly feuding with the nobles who elect them. Now, these German nobles are trying to resist the empire, the emperor's continuous attempts to govern them, to rein in their powers, as well as church taxes. The English monarchy has just emerged out of the War of the Roses. The House of Tudor is in charge. They are the kings. However, this is only the second generation from the end of the war, with Henry VIII being in power, and they are anxious about any crisis that could jeopardize the House of Tudor's status as the royal house and lead to a resumption of the war. Then you have France. It's just a large, very Catholic country. Spain finished its Reconquista with the reconquest of Granada in 1492. Spain was previously a collection of various medieval kingdoms, Christian and Muslim. However, the countries that ended up completing the Reconquista, this crusade to take back Spain, were Catholic. However, this Catholicism is really all that united them. These countries spoke different languages, had different histories of ruling families, and as a result of this, Catholicism is sort of the only thing holding Spain together. And then we have Switzerland, a loose confederation of the Swiss cantons. So here's a map. Now you can see these countries. This area covered in red in here is the Holy Roman Empire, composed of numerous territories. Down here is the Papal States, Spain, France, England, etc. So, the rise and fall of papal power. So, the story of the papacy begins with St. Peter, who was martyred in Rome in the 1st century. After his martyrdom, the bishops of Rome, the city where he died, were considered his successors. This idea of the bishop as successor of the apostle was confirmed in the Council of Nicaea, which established the clerical principle of apostolic succession, AD 325. From there on, the popes continued to gain more power, particularly during the coronation of Charlemagne. By crowning Charlemagne emperor of the Romans, the pope essentially established himself as having the authority to make and therefore unmake emperors. This status would continue to affect papal dealings with the Holy Roman Empire, the successor state to the Carolingian Empire. Cluniac monastery system of monasteries that were directly headed by the Pope. They answered only to the Pope. And as a result of this, this began to increase the idea of the Pope as someone to whom bishops and abbots owed special respect and allegiance. The Crusades. Calling Crusades instantly is a papal area. The popes, beginning with Urban II and later other popes, called these Crusades. It was their speeches that mobilized the population, and their legates were part of the First Crusade, and at least one of the champions of the Crusade carried a papal banner. Additionally, universities, which were controlled and protected by the Church, and they were the ones who developed the notion of papal plentitudo potestatis, or the completeness or fullness of papal power. However, there we have the fall, the Avian papacy. Around the year 1200 or so, we begin to see cases of popes of French descent who, due to animosity within the Italian population, instead decide to relocate from the city of Rome to the city of Avion in Paris. Now, whether or not these popes were or were not under the thumb of the French king is up for some debate. And even though there are many historians who say they were not, the overwhelming fact is simply that the population began to conceive the papacy as being able to be manipulated by monarchs. Additionally, then you have the Great Schism. The schism, in which there were multiple popes reigning at once, began to cause people to lose faith in the papacy. After all, it's hard to have faith in a papacy when there's 3 reigning popes, but only one of them can by canon law be the real pope. Additionally, the schism produced a movement called conciliarism. Since the schism was resolved by the Council of Constance, it was seen by many that, simply put, perhaps ecumenical church councils were the way to govern church affairs. And lastly, the Renaissance popes. Popes that belonged to wealthy Italian families like the Medicis and the Borgias, who were more interested in heading the papal states and being rich sponsors of artists and patrons of scholars than actually being a cleric, actually being a priest or a bishop. And as a result, people began to see the popes as corrupt, more secular rulers, lacking the sort of apostolic grace that people expected of leaders in a Christian religion. All this comes to a head in Wittenberg in 1517. Now, during this time, the papacy was trying to raise funds for the construction of a church in Rome, a cathedral. And one of the ways it was done was through the sale of indulgences. What an indulgence was, essentially, is you pay a penitential fine. You would pay a sum of money, and in return for that penance, you or whomever you purchased the indulgence for, like a deceased relative, would be absolved of their sins, allowed to go to heaven. However, there were controversies over the way people handled this. Many individuals felt the need to buy them for dead relatives, or to stockpile these indulgences against future iniquities they planned on committing. This eventually aroused the ire of another German cleric. Since Johann Tetzel was one of the ones selling these in the area, his main theological rival was a German monk named Martin Luther, who published his complaint with the 95 Theses. Luther's theses created a large argument within the church. Eventually, he was declared a heretic, was arrested, and tried before the Reichstag by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe at the time, who, due to the Habsburg possessions in Central Europe, as the Holy Roman Emperors in Austria, in Spain, and by extension of Spain in the New World, this man had close to 3 continents under his dominion. This was the most powerful man in Europe, and Luther stood against him. And, through the help of several German nobles, war erupted, and Lutheranism would eventually result as an independent Christian religion. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, around the same time as Luther, a cleric named Zwingli emerges. He's a Protestant reformer. His doctrines were a little different than Luther. Whereas Luther believed that communion was consubstantial with God, meaning it was of the same substance, at least to a true believer, Zwingli argued differently, saying that it was in fact just a symbolic act. He led the Protestant urban cantons, which were several states in Switzerland, against the Catholic forest cantons, a battle which he lost, was killed, and was subsequently beheaded. However, this caused a schism within the Protestant religion between Luther and his consubstantialist assumptions, and Zwingli with his symbolic ideals about the Eucharist, which was already divorced from the Catholic idea of transubstantiation. The priest transforms the Eucharist during the sacrament of the Mass. The result is we're now seeing not only a schism between Catholics and Protestants, but schisms within Protestantism as well. Now, Zwingli's ideas about symbolic Eucharist, combined with the idea of predestination, which Luther was very popularly advocating for, were combined in a man named John Calvin in his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, predestination is a peculiar doctrine many of you aren't familiar with. Predestination asserts that at the beginning of time God picked a certain number of souls, not terribly many, at random, to be saved, to be the elect, the saints. He then damned the rest to hell. And whether or not you were one of the saved or one of the damned was already determined at the dawn of time. And you just kind of had to figure that out. It was very popular at this time, and Calvin was one of the most influential preachers of this idea. He founded his religion in France, where it was persecuted, but it was also entangled in religious warfare. Here the Calvinist Protestants were called the Huguenots. Calvin eventually relocated to Geneva, Switzerland, which had asked him to come to run the city, which was in distress. He there established a model Calvinist community. In fact, at the time, Geneva was sometimes called Protestant Rome. The Puritans and the Presbyterians were later offshoots of this Calvinist branch. The Church of England. The Church of England is very interesting. Unlike the other churches, the Zwingliists, the Lutherans, and the Calvinists founded their faith based on religious convictions. The Church of England was founded based on more political considerations. It was founded by Henry VIII, second king of the House of Tudor, and what happened was he became head of the church in England, which is what he first called himself, after a dispute with the Pope. You see, at the time he was married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon is related to Charles V. But, this is where life gets complicated. He married her, but she was unable to produce a male heir. She'd produced a child for him, but it was only a daughter, a child named Mary. Now, regrettably, dear Henry was very concerned that having a daughter would cause a succession crisis that would result in a resumption of hostilities. He wanted to amend this trouble by having the Pope grant him an annulment for his marriage so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, whom he was also having an affair with at the time. The Pope, fearing hostilities with the Holy Roman Emperor if he annulled the marriage between his relative and the King of England, refused to allow Henry to have the annulment. Henry, desperately needing the annulment, especially as Anne had now become pregnant, decided it was best to declare himself by act of Parliament head of the Church in England, later head of the Church of England. This is how Anglicanism begins. The Church was originally made Protestant really in name only in the early days, but was made more Protestant under the young Edward VI, Henry's only son by his last wife. After the young and impressionable Edward VI died, Catholicism was reinstated under Mary I, who also went on to marry the Catholic King of Spain, Philip II. However, when she died, Philip did not inherit the throne of England, but by act of Parliament, the throne was conveyed to her sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth, being by Catholic law an illegitimate child, chose Anglicanism as her best and only path to rule. So, fear over conciliarism caused the Church to be very late in coming up with a response. Now, when they finally did come up with a response to the Council of Trent, they reaffirmed Catholic dogma while correcting some of the worst abuses of indulgences. but by this point a whole generation had grown up Protestant, and the damage was